Well, I'm glad to see everybody more or less survived last night and is here again. Really excited about the day that we have coming up for you. Very interesting presentations, and I think I'm really excited about our first presentation because Ms. Bickert was our dinner speaker last year, and I ran into her at another conference, and you know how you swing at every pitch, and I thought, I'm going to take a shot here, and I said, Monika, would you possibly be interested in coming back? And she said yes right away, and her schedule is unbelievable. Being the head of global policy, underline the word global because she's going all over the world all the time. And can I tell a story about when I first met her? It was out at the Aspen Security Forum, and she was on a panel, and allow me to say it was a controversial panel, and I think some people thought that they were going to fool her on a question or something, and there were heads lying in front of her. She really took on the group. I thought, oh, this woman ought to be a lawyer. Then I looked up, she is a lawyer, and that's and that's the interesting thing about her. I would encourage you to read her biography because there's so much in there, and I think it's a very interesting path in the law and illustrating different ways that a law degree can be used. And she obviously was a U.S. attorney, and hopefully you'll tell us a little bit about that experience. But she also was legat at, was that Bangkok. The official at? Yeah, that's the legat at the embassy.
Yeah, I was detailed from Justice Department to the State Department and worked at U.S. Embassy Bangkok for about 5 years.
And you survived the traffic in Bangkok?
It actually wasn't that bad. I would go in really early, like 5 a.m.
But she, and just such a wonderful person. And my colleague, David Hoffman from Intel, he has taught here, co-taught, taught, and has been such a big supporter. Another person on the Duke faculty who has really reached out to our center to make it what it is, and David is just, he's our partner in crime. Oh, I guess we shouldn't, that's not the right audience to say partner.
Partner in crime fighting.
Crime fighting, yeah, partner in crime fighting. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them, and looking forward to hearing everything this morning. Thanks.
Great. So first, just want to thank General Dunlap for making this opportunity available, and thanks to the law school for continuing to provide support so that we can bring everybody together, and thanks to Monika for being here this morning. We've got a lot of ground to cover.
We do.
So why don't we launch right into it, and we definitely want to leave time for questions later on.
I'm just going to drink out of the bottle here.
No, that's great. I'll ramble on while you do that. First thing, I think General Dunlap gave a brief overview of what it means to be the head of global policy. Why don't you put in context some of the other things that we're going to talk about? Maybe you could briefly describe the contours of that role.
Sure. So like Charlie said, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I wouldn't miss it. I love it. I was a federal prosecutor for more than a decade, and then I jumped over to Facebook in a legal role, and then I took over policy, meaning that I'm responsible for how people use, the policies for how people use our products. And that includes what can they post, what can they advertise, how can developers use data. And increasingly, we also have some sub-teams that work across the company in different areas. So for instance, I have a team that manages children's safety and women's safety across the company, meaning the engineers, the way we interact with law enforcement, and so forth. And about 2 years ago, we started a team that is the counterterrorism team for the company that I also manage that has engineers and lawyers and so forth. So that's it.
That's great. I mean, and there's a lot underneath that we're going to dig into, obviously. The first one, I think the title of the conference is a good one for us to explore at the start, complexity and security. My view, having come to Lens now for a number of years, that every year there is something that happens at the Lens conference which actually changes the overall conversation of what's happening on law and ethics and national security. A few years ago, General Dunlap had invited Ben Wittes from Brookings and Lawfare to come here, and Ben had just recently written a book called The Future of Violence. And Ben posited something that people had talked a little bit before, but I think he addressed it more articulately and in more detail than others had, which I want to ask you about, because I think it was prescient in setting the landscape for a certain conversation. And that discussion was around his view that we were moving into an environment where security threats were having two things happening. One, they were becoming more diffuse, that those charged with trying to control security threats were having a much more complicated time figuring out where those threats would be coming from and identifying the threat actors. And number two, because of advances in technology, small groups of actors or individuals had the ability to do a much greater degree of harm. So Ben posited this theory to say, if the threats are becoming more diffuse, then don't our efforts to address the threats have to similarly become more diffuse and decentralized? And doesn't that mean that governments, number one, are going to have to collaborate more with each other, but they're also going to have to look for other partners to help them address the threats? And in the book, Ben describes that technology companies, and particularly large platforms on the internet and technology, would be partners and have to figure out how to engage in that space. And so your description of the part of your role of addressing counterterrorism and that modification over just about that same amount of time over the last couple of years is really interesting. And I was wondering if you could talk about what Facebook is doing there and some of the challenges that you see.
Yeah, so with terrorism, there is a lot more collaboration. The threats have become more difficult to track. Something that Nathan mentioned last night was thinking about, as you see the decline, for instance, taking ISIS as one group, but as you see the decline of what they call their caliphate, you also see the rise in inspired attacks, where people are in their own network, homegrown terrorists, in their own network at home, planning attacks. Those are harder to find. So it is true that things have gotten more, the threats have gotten more diffuse over time, and that requires a different sort of defense. Luckily, I think there's some advancements that we're making, and I'll talk broadly about our approach in a moment, but there's increased collaboration among the industry. There's increased collaboration with governments, but there are also technological developments that we've seen in the past couple of years that have allowed us, I think, to respond to a growing and changing threat. So our response to terrorism, our approach to terrorists who would try to use our services is first to try to find the actual terrorists, the actual criminals, take them off the site and refer them to law enforcement. Second, to try to remove terror propaganda, which violates our policies. We don't allow any content that praises or supports terror groups or their actions. So if we become aware of somebody posting an ISIS propaganda video or somebody saying, boy, I thought that attack was great, then we would remove that sort of content as soon as we find it. And then the third thing is engaging with civil society to try to help people use social media to push back on these narratives. We think that's a really important part of the equation as well. And you and I have not spoken about this, but there's a couple interesting initiatives that we're doing there, including researching what kind of counterspeech actually works to reach different target audiences, and then funding or facilitating programs where the right credible speakers can get these tools and use them, including doing programs with universities worldwide. So lots to talk about with terrorism. On the first topic, on how we interact with law enforcement once we find that somebody is actually a terrorist, somebody who's, for instance, planning an attack or considering traveling to fight for a terror group or fundraising for a group, anything like that, if we find it on our site, they are not only violating the law, they are violating our terms in a way that allows us to proactively provide that data to law enforcement. And so that's something we do regularly. And then we also have a team that responds if law enforcement reaches out to us and they say, here's a search warrant for somebody that we're looking at for terrorism. They give us the warrant, we'll provide the data. We then fan out from what they have given us, and we will look at associated accounts and other bad actors to make sure that there aren't other threats that we should also be paying attention to and potentially referring.
So I'm particularly interested in your comments about the research on the impact of counterspeech and the ways to implement that. There's a Washington, D.C. lawyer who many people in the room probably know, Chris Wolf, who has been at Hogan Lovells, who wrote a book co-authored it with the head of the Anti-Defamation League.
Viral hate book?
That's right, the viral hate book. And positing the theory, and Chris speaking from the perspective of both being Jewish and openly gay, that he would actually much prefer a counter-speech response instead of taking speech down. And the challenge I would perceive, and I want you to be able to talk about, is traditionally, Facebook's been an open platform and talked about, provides a platform to people to speak about whatever they want to speak. The efforts like your counter-speech initiative, though, seem to be moving more in the direction of we want to do something more than just provide an open platform for that speech and that counter-speech. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the tension in that evolution and where Facebook's at.
Sure. We have long had policies. In fact, I've been to the company now 6 years, 5 years with policy. And when I joined policy, we already had rules in place that said, for instance, no harassment, no sharing somebody's personal information, no terror propaganda. Those were already in place. And those exist because we want Facebook. Well, I guess they exist for two reasons. One is we want Facebook to be a good place. We don't want to be a platform where people are coordinating harm or violence or bullying others. But there's also a business motive there, which is you want people to come and use the product. And they're not going to come if they think it is a place that is not safe. So we've had those policies in place for a long time. They are driven by what we think is necessary to keep people safe, and then also some legal compliance stuff. But like, intellectual property and that sort of thing. But primarily these are about safety. And that I don't think will change. The counter-speech stuff is interesting. And I agree with Chris. I think it is better if you have an idea that you think is leading people to ignorance or violence, and you want to push back on that idea, I think the best thing to do is actually to speak out against it rather than to just remove the content. Removing terror propaganda, I think, is the right thing to do, but I do not think it's going to stop terrorism. It's not. I don't think you change hearts and minds by just removing beheading videos. So we do think the counterspeech is an important part of this. We've seen counterspeech organically happening in the Facebook community for many years. So, one example that we highlighted earlier as a company was somebody was getting bullied in his high school, and his classmates rallied around him, and they changed their profile picture to be him. A subtle form of counterspeech that really helped solve a situation. We've seen that in the terrorism space for a long time. What we are trying to do is make the groups who want to engage in counterspeech better equipped to do so. So research that we've done has looked at things like what types of media will people engage with? Not shockingly, some of this is pretty simple. Not shockingly, photos are more engaging than a textual post. A short video is better than a longer one. It's got to be short and punchy. Things like humor in the tone, positive tone, they work a lot better than a serious or pessimistic tone. We look at things like what are the types of groups that will share content and will interact with content, and how do you speak differently to those groups? We've done research with some external research organizations looking at counter-terror efforts by groups in countries like France, the UK, Tunisia, Morocco, India, Indonesia, and then we've published those results. And we have worked with civil society groups, more than, gosh, probably around 100 groups in Europe, and then hundreds of universities around the world where we try to get those learnings out there so they can use them when they are creating their own counter-speech initiatives on Facebook.
So, and I want to come back to the counter-speech topic when we come to a different topic in a little bit. But you mentioned both the counter-speech efforts and those types of efforts. You also mentioned the collaboration with governments that you need to do. You know, Facebook operates a global platform, and so you've got many different governments, many of which are going to have conflicting goals and objectives and unique cultural, historic, economic perspectives and laws. And how do you navigate the complexity of that when you might have, you know, if I was an account owner, I might have one friend in Japan who would also be commenting on my feed, and then another friend that could be in Argentina, for example, commenting on the feed.
It's a real challenge. We have more than 2 billion people who are regularly using Facebook, and more than 85% of those are outside the United States. So when you think about the different cultures that are in this community and the different ideas they have about what's okay to share, it looks really different between Brazil and Japan and Russia and Turkey. And those governments have very different ideas about what's okay to share. So we are headquartered in the United States. We certainly follow US laws. Beyond that, we have our set of, so let's say US laws down here, I mean, because US laws are so permissive in terms of speech. And then beyond that, we have our community standards, which are global. And that's what I mentioned earlier, where you say you can't bully, you can't harass, you can't do a death threat, you can't post terror propaganda. So those are our standards that are global that we enforce whenever we find content that violates those policies. And then above that, you sometimes have individual requests from governments. The German government will reach out and say, you may not consider this hate speech, but we do in Germany. This is illegal speech, and we expect you to remove it and respect German law. They've actually recently published a law to that effect that really puts the onus on us to make legal determinations about what content violates the law in Germany. It's hugely problematic for a lot of reasons. But when we have requests from governments, we will generally look at, is the request a valid form of legal process? So is it a court order or whatever their law requires that they have to restrict speech? And then second, is the law that they are citing, is that something that's consistent with international norms? Or is this, say, a law that discriminates against people based on their sexual orientation or their gender? And then beyond that, we'll look at whether or not the content actually falls under the law anyway. And so in the German example I gave, let's say the Germans say, we think this is hate speech in Germany and you need to take it down. We would look at the legal process they gave us. Let's say that's adequate. If it's not, we would ask them to change it. The next thing we would look at is this law consistent with international norms? It probably is. And then we would look at the third prong, which is, does this content actually fall under that law? And we reach out to independent counsel or outside counsel in Germany, and we'll ask for their opinion. And sometimes they will come back and say, we actually don't think this is illegal. And then we'll go back to the German government and say, we're getting a different opinion and we don't think we should restrict this. So there is a dialogue that happens between us and various governments. Sometimes we'll end up restricting that speech. And I use the word restricting rather than removing, because what we would do is make it unavailable in Germany to German users. It would still be available to everybody else. Everybody in this room would see it. And then we publish those restrictions in a report called our Government Request Report that we put out every 6 months, so people can see who are the countries who are removing a lot of speech. Not shockingly, you know, Germany's up there, Turkey's up there, India's up there. You tend to see a lot of the same players.
So Monika, can you describe just a little bit how that works in practice on a particular feed? So I gave that example earlier, and maybe I should change my example a little bit, where it's, you know, I could be an American living in Germany, as I did for a couple of years, and then have my friends here in the United States, and people, let's say, in Japan also.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that I don't like doing this, actually. It's one of the reasons I don't like it when we have to restrict content, is because it leads to a very weird experience for people who are communicating in this borderless online world. So if you are a person let's say that you're an American living in Germany, you've got a German friend, you've got a Japanese friend, you've got me as your friend over in the US, and your Japanese friend posts this hate speech that is illegal in Germany, and the German government comes to us and says, take it down, and we restrict it in Germany. For your Japanese friend would still be able to see it. I would still be able to see it in the US. Your German friend in Germany would not be able to see it. For you, you probably would be able to see it. It depends. We're looking at different signals to determine where a person is a user of Facebook. We do look at things like your IP address. So, depending on what your IP address is, what you've listed as your location, other signals that will allow us to tell, because of course people do VPN, and sometimes IP address is not the best signal, but we look at various signals that will allow us to determine where somebody is. If we think the person is in Germany, then we would block it, but we would not always know that.
So I think we're starting to get a sense of the complexity of what you made sound very simple at the beginning with your role and your team. I want to make that even a little bit more complex in line with Charlie's topic here. Hate speech seems hard enough, but there seem to be other even more difficult topics. So maybe could you walk through like a situation where if you got some service of process in Turkey for content that was being critical of the Turkish government, for example?
Yeah, that's where you get into that second prong about does the law comply with international norms. Sometimes we will have requests to block speech that are really about blocking political speech. This speech is illegal in our country because there's a law in our country that says you can't criticize the king or you can't criticize the government. In those cases, we look at a variety of factors, including, is this service going to be blocked? Is Facebook going to be blocked in this country if we don't comply? And I'll give an example from a couple of years ago, since you mentioned Turkey, which is in the run-up to municipal elections in Turkey. Oh no, I have that feeling I'm going to sneeze.
That was good forecasting, though. That was great.
I wanted to actually make sure I did sneeze, because if you say that and then you don't. But
you kept your promise. That was great.
In the run-up to the Turkish municipal elections, we had a request from the Turkish government to remove some content that was critical of, if memory serves, I think it was about Erdogan's brother or something, but it was critical of the government. And we got it, YouTube got it, Twitter got it. YouTube and Twitter, the Turkish government took them both down. They blocked those sites entirely. And then we were facing a situation of, do we remove this video, the specific link that the government has given us, or do we say we're going to stand on the principle that we won't block political speech and have our site blocked? And we made the decision to remove the video. And we did it because we thought that the principle we articulated at the time was that we want the most voice for the most people. And we thought people in Turkey needed access to social media. There were other ways they would see this video. There's often what we call the Streisand effect. You've probably heard that term, but where if, there's a long story that goes behind that, you can read it on Wikipedia, but basically the idea is if you try to hide speech, people are going to talk about the fact that you're hiding speech and it ends up getting highlighted. And we've seen that happen in multiple situations where we'll say, okay, we're going to block this video about Erdogan's brother and blah, 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 and then people talk about it and it's all over, and that actually did get a fair amount of press attention, and then our thinking was that actually was probably better for everybody if we complied with that request.
So let's make this maybe even a little bit harder. Election integrity has been in the news quite a bit, and not just here in the United States, but all around the world, putting Facebook in a very difficult situation to determine what you would do and how you would respond to that. What's the conversation like internally right now around election integrity?
It's an area of big investment for us right now. We've had a team for a long time that has focused on not just election integrity, but Facebook as a part of the democratic process, making sure, for instance, that candidates who are running for office can use Facebook, they know how, their accounts are protected, there aren't imposters, they're not hacked, that sort of thing. So that has been an area where we've devoted resources for a long time. I think what we've seen recently, especially around the U.S. election and questions about Russian attempts to interfere with the election, are what if there are more subtle ways that elections, people might try to interfere with elections through social media. And that's, you mentioned threats becoming more diffuse and what that looks like. If you look in the terrorism space, where we were a few years ago, we were kind of doing our own thing, say 4 years ago. We were really focused on countering terrorism within Facebook, and we were working alone. If you look at where we are now, we are sharing hashes of terrorist imagery with 13 other companies in a defined database. We have formed an industry consortium that's very public about countering terrorism. We speak very publicly with governments about how we're collaborating together, so it's really changed. In the election integrity world, I think you're starting to see those same things. So we're now reaching out to election commissions around the world. We'd done that a little bit before, now it's much more concentrated. We're developing technical tools that allow us to find the fake accounts that would be, like in the Russian investigation in the United States, the accounts that have been at issue in that investigation all violated our policies because they were fake accounts. And we've gotten a lot better at finding fake accounts. So there's also greater industry collaboration. We're reaching out to others in industry and saying we better share the types of threats that we're seeing. If we're hearing something from a particular government, we better share that so that we can get on top of it.
And not even just fake accounts, but if the allegations that have been in some of the recent indictments coming from the U.S. government to actually the product of illegal activity and potentially even identity theft and fraud, making it not just a violation of Facebook's policy, but actually a violation of the law for the underlying theft of the identity that creates the fake account.
Do you mind if I just explain a little bit of that?
Oh, yeah, no, I may have summarized that too quickly.
No, just so we have policies in place that say you cannot use a fake name on Facebook. You have to use your real name. Now, we don't check people at the gates. So if you go and create a fake account today and you put Susie Jones as your name and you engage in what looks to be pretty normal activity and nobody ever reports you, we are not going to ask you for your ID, most likely. If you start using our payments tools, you're trying to run ads or something like that, you would get asked for it. But if there is a reason to think your account might be fake, or if you are trying to use our payments tools, we would reach out and say, can you upload an ID? If we don't get a satisfactory ID, then we would remove the account. Now, if somebody is, and I obviously can't go into the details of an ongoing investigation, but if somebody is actually using a fake ID that they have stolen from somebody else to subvert our systems, then you're talking about a whole different level of bad activity. And that's more than just, okay, well, then we take down your accounts. Then there's, we might actually be seeing legal process about that, and we might be looking at that issue very differently.
Yeah, and I probably muddied the waters there between, and once again, further complexity. You've got the accounts, people creating accounts, you've got payment tools, and you've got people buying ads too, and a variety of different levels of identification and checks there. I want to jump from there and come back a little bit to the idea of counterspeech. It's related to the election integrity issue to talk about, fake news has been in the discussion in our popular press now for quite a bit. And I want to talk about the difficulty. One of the difficulties I see is in this more diffuse approach to addressing threats and asking private sector companies, as two lawyers for private sector companies, some of that is then asking for decisions to be made by private sector entities that traditionally would have been made by government.
And that you might not want them to make.
Well, and this is, so particularly in this concept of fake news, if Facebook as a private sector entity is now potentially being asked to determine what's fake news and what's not, how's Facebook thinking about that?
Yeah, so when I talk about our content policies generally, I always say hate speech is our hardest policy. It's hard to enforce, it's hard to define. That's with our general content policies where the decision is, if it violates, remove it. If it doesn't violate, leave it up. All of that is simple compared to how to deal with something like fake news, because the choices you're making there are probably less likely to be binary, remove it and leave it up, and probably more likely to be a little more nuanced. Probably everybody in this room, I don't know, raise your hand if you disagree, but I'm guessing that everybody in this room would agree that you don't want a private company being the single arbiter of truth and saying, you shall believe this, you shall not believe that. So I think that's something people generally accept. But then when you use a term like fake news, some people use that to mean this is disinformation that is being deliberately spread by somebody with malicious intent. Frankly, the most common type of that is financially motivated actors. It's somebody who wants to lead people off, get them to click on something and lead them off site to get them to an ad farm or what have you for financial reasons. And then you have all the way at the other end of the spectrum, publications that are really sensationalist and might have headlines that are, hyperbolic in some way, or there's a slight slant to the story that people would say, that's not really a fair way to phrase it. Is that fake news? You've got this whole spectrum, and we have to kind of figure out what to do with that whole spectrum. So what we do there, I guess our approach mirrors the complexity of that issue. So on the one end of the spectrum, where you've got the real bad guys, we are trying to just remove that content. And we can remove it because they're often using fake accounts or because they are leading people off-site to ad farms. You still have to uncover the bad actors, but that false news or disinformation should go away if we get good at detecting those. And then for the other stuff, so there's finding bad guys and removing them. There's also promoting good actors. So if you've got at the very far end over here, you have your very responsible publications that are putting a lot of effort into getting their stories right. So get rid of the bad guys. The second part is help the good guys. And that means working with these media outlets, many of whom have really struggled to make the transition to the online world of online consumption, and helping them succeed. So we launched a project back in January, so a little over a year ago, January of 2017, called the Facebook Journalism Project, where we're working with thousands of publishers around the world to help them use social media and to hear from them what they need. And we've actually made product changes at Facebook based on their feedback. We're using instant articles, which is a Facebook feature, but it's really hard to monetize. We can't sell ads through that. We can't exist like that. And then we would say, okay, well then let's find a way to allow you to monetize. So there's been a lot of back and forth there, and there's more work to be done, but that's helping the responsible players. And then what do you do with all that stuff in the middle? I think a lot of what we do is we try to help people tell the difference. And that is about not just developing sophistication among our society, and especially young people. I do think that's important. We can come back to that. And we are engaged in that, trying to help people develop critical analysis skills for discerning what is likely to be a reputable source and what is not.
We may have to call this the Facebook Law School.
But that's something, I think that is really important. That's something I have a couple daughters who are teenagers, and that's something I focus on with them, is if they're seeing a news source online, they should know who it is before they just believe the story. And that's something I think we need to work on as a society, and we're trying to get those educational efforts, find them and help facilitate them. But there's something more, which is what can we do in the product to help people tell the difference? And we've been testing different things here, some of which I think have a lot of promise. We're trying to identify sources that might not be reputable. Part of that is by empowering our community to report to us if they think something is fake. Part of it is by using back-end signals that tell us, hey, the way this story is being shared is a little weird. People tend to share it, and then they tend to unshare it and delete it, meaning maybe their friend said, hey, idiot, this is not true. This is a hoax. So when we see that kind of behavior, or when we're getting reports from our community, we are working with third-party fact-checking organizations to check some of this content. And then what we try to do is put the context out there for people who might see this content. So you come across an article in your newsfeed on Facebook, and underneath it, we'll do something called, we'll show you something called related articles, where we will show you other stories on the same topic from mainstream media sources. Another thing we'll do is give you a little icon for more information, and you click on that, and it will give you information about the publisher that we've taken from the internet, including from sites like Wikipedia, where we'll say, here's this publisher, here's who they are, here's what they're about. And this is a way of saying, we're not going to say this is true or this is false, but we are going to say, make sure you're paying attention to the source, and here's what we can tell you about the source, and you can go forth and find further information on your own. We're going to keep, I think, iterating here. We'll see what's working, and no doubt that the threats will continue to evolve, and so our approach will also continue to evolve.
That's great, and so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to lead into that with the counterspeech example, because it seems to me this is mechanisms to enable counterspeech and to allow people to see counterspeech to come to informed decisions instead of just decisions. One last topic really quickly before we jump to questions, because I do want to leave time for questions, which is you manage a team with a bunch of different skill sets, but including lawyers who are playing a bit of non-traditional roles as lawyers. And we've got a bunch of law students here in the room. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see of things they should be thinking about now while they're in law school to build the right tools to be able to take advantage of opportunities like that might be less traditional for law students to pursue.
My team, so just for context, on certain subspecialty teams like counterterrorism, we have about 180 people across the company that are focused on counterterrorism. But on my policy team that are writing the policies and overseeing their enforcement, so sort of the legislative branch of all of this policy crafting and the judiciary of how we implement the policies, that team is about 60 people globally. They are mostly lawyers, but they are not functioning as lawyers for the company. We partner with our colleagues on the legal team at Facebook, but they were all working in policy.
And you used to be a member of that legal team, right?
I was, yeah. I was when I came in. I think my current job is actually a lot more fun. But there's a lot of things that go into why it's more fun. So first of all, I would say there's something special about the legal education. I think it trains you to think a certain way, and that's why it's important to me to hire lawyers. I find that lawyers have a real knack for good writing and the kinds of writing that we need, and we should talk a little bit more about that because I think it's so important. And also for analyzing, if you pass a policy that says this and it's designed to go after this bad behavior, you're also going to end up taking down this good behavior. And that lawyers are naturally very good at that. So that's why it's important for me to hire them. And the people on my team are lawyers from a variety of different backgrounds. Many of them worked for NGOs or government before they came to Facebook. And so one piece of advice I would give to people who are interested in working on a team like mine or working on these issues is become an expert in something. Don't just sort of go to a tech company and think, well, I think I want to be in tech. I think you have a better chance of getting to work on the really interesting issues if you go somewhere like a government agency or an NGO, or somewhere where you're probably not making a ton of money, but where you are given a lot of responsibility and you are working on an issue that you're really passionate about. Because when I'm looking to hire, that's what I want. I also am looking for good writers, and that's something that I think when you're in undergrad, I mean, one of my undergraduate majors was English, so a lot of the focus was like, be a beautiful writer and use pretty words, and that's nice, but that doesn't work well in a business environment, and I don't think that's just Facebook. I suspect that is true.
It's not what the CEO is looking for in an email.
Right. I mean,
coming, right?
people, if I'm writing to my bosses, they are reading it on this. Yeah. And so the emails have to be short and crisp, and there's a way that you structure these things. If you're not getting to what you need them to do, when you need them to do it, and what your recommendation is in the first 2 sentences, you have failed. And so when I'm hiring people, I'm looking to see, are they good writers, and will they bring some sort of expertise from the outside world with them? My last piece of advice for people who are in law school right now, I think would be find work that your heart is in. I think I hear so many, this probably is not a room that needs to worry about this that much, but you talk to people about law school and they go, well, I'm not sure about law school because when I talk to lawyers, they all seem so miserable. Well, I think the people who are usually miserable are the people who have sort of followed the money trail. And I think if you say, I'm going to work on something that I'm passionate about, the law is an amazing place to be.
I completely agree. I tell young people who are thinking about going to law school that all the time. Like, that doesn't need to be that way.
Right.
But let's open up for questions. General Dunlap?
We have questions because, yes, sir.
I have 2 things. I'm Bruce Curran. I'm an adjunct professor of journalism at UNC Chapel Hill, so don't throw anything. You guys seem to be really, really effectively interacting with a lot of foreign governments. Do you think you could call the folks in Washington and help them along, as they don't seem to be doing quite as well with that stuff?
Actually, I think that's a really good question. Are there things, techniques, and so forth that Facebook has found effective that lots of things might not be able to transfer to government? Any thoughts on that?
I would say we do have very good dialogues going with the U.S. government right now. And in fact, Nathan last night, who, I don't know if you were at the dinner last night,
Yes.
but a regular part of my job is engaging with people on the Hill or people like Nathan or people in the administration who are working on these issues, because we all have we all are learning things based on our unique perspective, and I think we all want the same things really, in terms of we don't want terrorists to be using the site, we want the internet to be a safe place, and so there's a lot that we do get from working with one another. There's always ways that we can do better on both sides, but for instance, the German law I mentioned earlier, we talked to the German government about that beforehand. We said, here's how we think it's going to affect us. We don't think it's going to be good. They passed it anyway, and we're seeing the consequences of that now. So I think the engagement's important, but it is really happening in the U.S. As well as elsewhere.
Can I test one thing I just want to throw out on this topic and get your reaction to? I believe strongly that U.S. technology companies and the products and services that we produce being accepted and trusted around the world and used around the world is good both for the economic security of the United States and the national security of the United States. So having the support of the U.S. government to make sure that our products can be trusted around the world is then a critically important thing to preserving national security. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And definitely those conversations are, as I'm sure you're finding in your role too, I think those conversations are increasing.
I think that's right. And
Since I'm a journalist with the General, let me have a follow-up.
No.
I'll be around after, though. We can talk after.
Seriously, we know each other for a long time. You'll have your chance. I want one of our scholars here to.
Hi, I'm Jessica Abbey. I'm a Vanderbilt law student. I was wondering if you could go into the mechanisms of how you find bad content. Like, is it all reporting, or what alternatives do you use? And also, how do a person's privacy settings affect the analysis? If a post can only be seen by their friends or their family,
Great.
How do you look at that?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first, which is that it doesn't matter. If you post something in a private message to somebody, you post an ISIS video or an image of child pornography in a private message to somebody, we would treat that the same as if you did it publicly. In terms of how we find bad content, 5 years ago, I would have told you it is overwhelmingly user reports, people reporting through the site. That's not true anymore. We've gotten better at using technology to find bad content. So now for ISIS and Al-Qaeda propaganda, more than 99% of what we remove, we find ourselves before anybody has reported it to us. And that's through using tools like image matching. If we have a known bad image, we can, or a video or still, we can use technology to stop that at the time of upload. It's through things like fanning out from accounts, trying to find associated bad actors and using various signals there. We're getting better at tracking recidivists. So if you look at the number of, say, terrorism accounts that we take down, a lot of those people are people who we've kicked off before and they have tried to come back. And so using signals to identify who they are and stop them have gotten better. And then things that are more complicated, like artificial intelligence, machine learning around natural language processing. We're investing in that. We're getting better. Right now, we're mostly using that in combination with other tools. So looking for who's talking about ISIS would not be actually that helpful. You'd find a lot of journalists and you'd find a lot of people who are just talking about the news. But if you're able to look for who's sharing certain sorts of images and what kinds of words are they using, then you have a more complete picture that allows you to send stuff to our review teams for analysis. I will say, because I hear this a lot internationally, people will say, oh, well, how much content are your algorithms taking down? Generally, our technology is not removing the content. It is flagging the content. we're then sending it to our thousands of reviewers around the world who look at it and see if it actually violates or not. Hopefully, we're going to get to the point where the technology does more of this by itself, but we're not there yet.
Unfortunately, we really are out of time, but I think, Monika, can you stay around a few minutes afterwards? Because I got.
Do we have a break right now, or is there another panel going right now?
We're going on break right now.
Okay.
And then we have another panel coming up. I want to thank Monika for really taking time out of her schedule. This is truly world-class, a world-class person who is the expert, and the fact that she's so generous with her time, it really means a lot, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to go on break here for 15 minutes, but here's the good news, folks. We've already had 2 donors. If you want to join them, Cy, one wants to remain anonymous. Cy, where are you? Oh, there we go. Yeah, you want to get that snazzy ribbon? Okay, we'll see you in 13 minutes now.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry I crashed out last night. No, we had a good time.